It's Sunday morning. I'm all set to ride. That is until I see this telltale black spot under the left fork of my Kawasaki ZX14. Now, it must have started leaking on yesterday's ride, so instead of doing this today, I'll be doing this. Tackling the seal replacement, and based on the color of the fork oil, a much needed service to these KYB Inverted Forks, which is coming up next. And if you're contemplating servicing your own inverted forks, then this is the video you've been looking for on Rod, Rides, and Wrenches. To start, we need good access to the front of the bike. On this ZX14, this means removing the upper nose or headlight fairing and headlights. Once the fairing is off, we can see and get access to the upper and lower steering yokes. Removing the front fender and brake caliper would come next, and I'll be taking this opportunity to replace the brake pads, clean the calipers up, and replace the steering stem bearings, but more on that a little later. For now, I'm going to show you how to take these forks apart so that you can replace your own seals, ensure the fork is clean before we put it back together, and confirm that we have the right amount of oil to go back in them with my fork oil gauge.
That way you know it's full.
Now, before we loosen the steering yoke bolts, there are two things that we need to do. First is to turn down the fork preload by turning the adjusters all the way counterclockwise. If you've already adjusted and set up your suspension sag, be sure to count the number of turns out that you make and write it down somewhere so that you can adjust them back into where they were after reinstalling. And the second is to be sure to loosen the fork top plug caps. Don't completely unscrew them just yet. Just break them loose to make removing them much easier once the forks are out of the bike. With the forks out, the top plug caps can be fully unscrewed and that nasty oil drained from the tube and disposed of. You'll note that on these KYB forks, the piston rod nut is covered by a plastic collar that holds the spring in place. Some older forks don't cover the spring here at the top, making it possible to remove the fork plug caps without using a spring compression tool. Not so on this ZX14. To help, I purchased this invaluable tool from Bikers Run. This professional grade spring compression tool makes servicing inverted forks by yourself a real breeze by allowing you to hold the spring collar down and giving you access to the locking nut on the fork piston rod and allowing you to remove that plug cap. The real value though in this tool, which I gotta admit, it doesn't come cheap, is that it makes doing this job much safer and allows you to take your time so that you don't damage your fork. There are other ways and tools that will allow you to compress the spring on an inverted fork, but none are as easy as this professional grade compression tool I picked up from Bikers Run. Now there's a link in the video description if you want to check one out for yourself. I'm also using this H-shaped radial pin spanner that slides over the piston rod. This spanner holds the spring down to make accessing the piston rod nut easier. I cannot stress enough how important these tools are in servicing inverted forks, and like I tell my wife, tools are an investment, not an expense. Again, there are links below in this video's description to where you can find these tools and more at great prices with free shipping, all from Bikers Run. With the fork plug cap removed, I can also take out that H-shaped pin spanner tool and gently, note I said gently, remove the tension from the spring. Back on the bench, we can now take apart the fork to clean it. There are two rods in the fork, the piston rod that the plug cap threads onto, and a damping rod. This inner, much thinner tube is the damping rod, so be careful not to bend it when taking it out. The spring retaining collar and washer come out next. With that out of the way, the fork spring also can come out. With these out of the way, I will slide the stanchion tube off the fork tube. Now you can see we still have a bit of work ahead of us with the amount of dirt and debris that are on the lower fork tube. If we put the forks back together without cleaning this area up, it will most likely just start leaking again. To remove the fork seal is pretty straightforward. Pry up on the dust shield to get it off the stanchion, pop out the seal retaining ring and keep track of it if you're going to reuse it like I am. And now using a large flathead screwdriver for leverage, I just pry up on the seal, being careful not to scratch the stanchion. I find it easiest just to pry up on one side of the seal to pop it out, rather than try to move the screwdriver around underneath the seal. Last out of the stanchion is the seal washer, which I'll also be reusing, so I'm setting it aside. After cleaning the fork tube exterior, removing as much of the road tar and stuck on dirt with brake clean, I'm using some 2000 grit sandpaper to take off any burrs or remaining debris from the area the stanchion and seals slide up and down on. Now this requires a light touch since you don't want to remove any of the chrome finish on the tube. After that, the tube is cleaned up with degreaser and a final blast of brake clean to remove any of the solvents. After drying inside and out with clean, lint-free rags, the fork will be ready for reassembly. Now I should point out that I did not remove the fork tube cylinder in the lower part of the tube. Removing this cylinder requires yet another special tool to hold it while you unscrew the Allen head bolt in the bottom of the fork. The fork cylinder does not have to come out for any reason in this case, since it can't be serviced. There are no parts that are available to replace in it, according to Kawasaki. Now, I did come across a video on YouTube where someone was able to remove the fork tube from the stanchion by unthreading those Allen bolts in the bottom of the KYB forks from a Hayabusa. I just would not recommend going this route for a couple reasons. One, the pistons on my forks couldn't be removed or reinstalled without that special tool holding it from the inside of the fork, which required complete disassembly anyway. And two, removing the fork plug cap as well as the spring will allow for proper fork oil leveling during reassembly, something that you'll see in a couple of minutes. Now, I prefer to use a leveling tool since we can get a more precise measurement of oil in the fork as compared to just pre-measuring oil in a cup and then trying to pour it down into an assembled fork. With a clean fork, I can now reinstall the fork seals, and to avoid damaging them, I will need to slide them onto the fork slide tube and not back in the stanchion tube where they came out from. Your keen eyes might have spotted a blue damping rod bleeder tool that I installed when I was cleaning up the forks. I used it to pump the piston and ensure there were no degreasers or oil left in the fork. It's another important tool but doesn't need to be on the fork right now, but it will come in very handy later on when I oil the fork, so you'll see it again. To start with, I wrap the top of the fork slider with one wrap of electrical tape to protect the seal when being slid over the lip of the tube. Replacing these seals is a time-consuming process, and I want to make sure they aren't damaged during reassembly. Next, I slide the dust seal and fork seal on the slide tube, making sure that they are lubricated with lithium grease. The spring retaining clip can be installed after the seals are set in the stanchion, so we can skip that for now and just slide the seal washer on next. A final note on seal installation is the direction of your seal. Sometimes it isn't always obvious which way a fork seal is supposed to be installed. A fork seal has 3 inner oil rings. One off on its own called the wiping seal, and 2 closely spaced together which are the oil rings. The 2 oil rings are always placed facing the oil in the fork, or in this case towards the wider fork stanchion tube. The single wiping ring will be closest in this case to the bottom of the fork or the axle. If you don't get the seal positioned properly, the seal will definitely leak since the rings will be pulling oil out of the fork and not holding it back in. With the seals in place on the fork tube, the electrical tape can be removed and the stanchion tube placed on the fork slide tube so that we can set the seals. Now I'm using the last fork seal driver tool I will ever own. It has 14 pieces which will allow me to use this fork seal driver kit with inverted or standard forks anywhere from 35mm to 50mm. It is a bit more than just buying one seal driver, but is certainly less than buying each of these drivers individually, and it does a much better job and is easier to use than the traditional drivers that use a one-piece adapter, since I find that these drivers don't make uniform contact with the seal and can drive it in crookedly. There is a link to this professional quality seal driver, which is, by the way, the best one I've ever used, down in the video description, along with a number of other tools that you may need to make performing this sort of work much easier yourself. With the seal driven home, the retaining clip can be spread over the slider tube and clipped in place. Because of the large surface area of my new seal driver, I was able to use it to help set the retaining clip in place by just sliding it around the tube. Final step is to clean the area around the oil seal and push that dust seal in place with your fingers. With the seals installed, just be careful not to pull the stanchion tube off of the slide tube, since unlike conventional style forks, inverted forks can still come apart unless that fork plug cap is installed. Moving back to the vise, I can pour approximately 567 milliliters or 19 ounces of 5-weight fork oil into my fork. It is also time to use that blue fork damping rod bleeder tool that you saw earlier, which threads onto the piston rod. The tool allows me to pump the fork piston rod up and down, making sure that air is expelled from the fork. Now, you need to move this rod through its full stroke 10 to 12 times to ensure that air is expelled from the piston area. Now, when you feel resistance throughout the rod stroke, you know you've done it properly. Before using the fork oil leveling tool, I confirm the stanchion is completely down on the bottom of the fork tube so that I'm measuring from the top of the slide tube and not having my measuring tool sit on the stanchion. The piston rod is also down at the bottom of its stroke, and the spring has not been installed. The fork is also leveled in the vise so that we can make sure that we get an accurate fork oil reading. The amount of oil in the fork should be 88 millimeters from the top of the fork tube. With the oil level set, and with the aid of the fork spring compressor tool, the fork spring is installed with the smaller coils on the end facing upward, followed by that spring retaining collar, and then they're compressed into the fork tube. After that, the damping rod tube and spring collar washer can be reinstalled. With the help of that pin spanner to hold everything in place, I can now mark 13 millimeters from the top of the damping rod down to the piston rod threads. This is how far the fork plug cap will be threaded on, and then that locking nut from the piston rod be tightened up against it. Be sure to replace the O-rings on the plug cap if needed. Mine were in great shape, so I'm just going to reuse them. Final step in rebuilding the forks is to load them up with some high-speed lithium complex grease. I do this by coating down the fork slide tube and compressing the fork slowly to the point where I can't push it down anymore. Now, once I have this line of grease on the forks, like this, I give it one more quick compression stroke, so I get past that previous line of grease. This loads the seals up. Now, because these seals were lubricated and greased when I installed them, it wasn't strictly necessary on this particular set, but it is a good idea to load up and grease the seals whenever you have the forks out of the bike. Whenever you're reinstalling forks, be sure to measure and match the height of them in the steering yoke using a caliper or some other precise measuring tool to confirm the forks are evenly installed. But before I did get to this step, I removed and upgraded the steering stem bearings to much stronger tapered bearings with new races, which will be on the next video in this series. Plus, I'll also show you on that video how to align the front forks so you don't encounter any adverse countersteer or tire dog tracking. If you want to check that one out, be sure to hit that subscribe and notification button to check out that video. And until next time, be sure to ride safe.
Too far.